putting companies ahead of countries. Today's prospective guest, a Danish ambassador, says top firms in California carry more weight on the global stage than many nations do. That's why he left his post in Indonesia for Silicon Valley. We're joined now live from there by the world's first ever tech ambassador, Mr. Casper Klynge. Ambassador Klynge, can I start simply by asking you, what exactly does a tech ambassador do?
Well, we're basically trying to treat the technology and the tech companies in a way which is similar to the way we treat a bilateral relationship with countries all over the world. And we do that in recognition that technology will perhaps be the key defining parameter on international affairs. But we also do it because some of the tech companies, not least some of them that are outside this studio, are becoming very, very large organizations. If you take the biggest four ones, the GAFAs here in Silicon Valley, the value of their stocks is more or less the same as the GDP of France. And we think that that is being translated into influence over political affairs and in the direction that the world is heading. And therefore, we think it is necessary to treat them in a way which is similar to the way we treat other countries.
And is there not, a very worrying conflict of interest when you look at it? I mean, there's often a blurry line between business and politics, but it sounds like you've crossed it completely, no?
Well, I think that's some of the criticism we've been facing, and I do understand where that criticism is coming from, but I think it's based on a misunderstanding about what diplomacy is. I mean, if you look at the countries where we are present, it's far from all countries where we agree with the regimes we are sort of the hosts of, and that also applies for the position I have now and the fact that we have a Danish tech representation with a global mandate. By the way, it's not only a representation to Silicon Valley or to the US. It's a representation that are dealing with technology and tech companies in the US, in Asia, and in Europe as well. And we don't put companies before countries. We do this not to replace traditional diplomacy, but to supplement traditional diplomacy. And I would actually argue that this is about bringing diplomacy back to its roots, because it's always been about putting people into areas of transformation in order to help prepare our society for changes, but at the end of the day also to seek influence and seek to protect our national interests.
Because one wonders, if it's always the biggest multinationals that get such a direct access to government, speaking to a tech ambassador, where do you find the fairness? How do smaller companies get a say?
Well, it's not only an initiative focusing on the big companies, although when we speak to media like yourself, the big companies tend to attract the most attention. But this is a very broad initiative, which is basically about preparing for the 21st century or the fourth industrial revolution. It's about making sure that Denmark or Scandinavia or indeed Europe is prepared for the changes that we think will come in our direction because of the fast pace of new technologies. And that's actually something where we're working very closely together with authorities back home. But it's also about helping the startup scene in Europe, which I think is extremely vibrant, so that we can also create some of the unicorns that they have here in the US and in Asia. We need them in Europe as well. They will be creating the jobs and the economic growth that we will need in the future. So that's also part of the initiative that we've launched.
I guess the economy there being a huge part of the initiative, and as I hear you saying, getting some kind of exchange on how all this new technology can be controlled. It looks like the European Union, though, is taken steps, when it comes to our privacy and all that the US hasn't so far. Am I right on that? I mean, where is this? Where do you draw the line between the importance of technological advance and somebody's privacy?
Well, I think it's important to say that the Danish government's diplomacy initiative is based on sort of an optimistic belief that technology will help solve some of the big global issues that we will be facing in the coming years. But it's also a realistic initiative where we are here also to protect core values of Europe, democracies, human rights, etc. And I think, if you ask me 7 months into my job, I would argue very heavily that I think Europe is really setting the standards in the global ecosystem of technology. I don't see any other player taking that role upon their shoulders. And that's an important part of my job as well, to make sure that European values, European points of views are also brought forward vis-a-vis the tech companies. So in that sense, it's a very traditional role for diplomacy, bringing information and knowledge back home to our capitals, but also representing views, in this case of Europe abroad, including in Silicon Valley. I
have to say, I'm curious as to how the EU is leading the way on this technical diplomacy, but all the better, I guess. But however, the more technologically dependent our countries become, the more vulnerable we are as well to things like cyber attacks. And we've seen that in your own native country in 2015, 2016. Malware, a serious problem there. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I represent a country which is very digitalized, and that brings a lot of opportunities with it. But it goes without saying that the flip side of the coin is a lot of vulnerabilities for cybersecurity attacks. And the way we protect ourselves is also part of the mandate that my team is looking at. But I think the view here is that we need to stick together, both as a European Union, as Europe, but we also need increasingly to involve the private sector in making sure that cybersecurity is at a level where it can protect us against those countries or those non-state actors that do not want to do good in the world. So reinventing a bit the relationship between the private sector and the public sector, we think will be necessary if we are to both protect ourselves and mitigate the challenges, but also reap the benefits that technology will bring about. Very finally, Ambassador Klynge, and briefly, how powerful do you think these private companies could become? Like, could we envisage seeing Google having a place at the UN Security Council, for example? Well, I don't personally think that's something we will see in the next couple of years, but to some extent what we're trying to do here is to retain a role for states and for governments, because I think when you live in Silicon Valley on a daily basis, or when you visit China and see what is happening on the technology scene, you can get a real sense of urgency that things are happening at a fantastically fast pace, and that these platforms does not respect the traditional borders. So what we're trying to do is in fact to make sure that states and nations and including regional organizations will continue to have a role in regulating and setting the right boundaries for technology to make sure that you and I will be protected, our data will be protected, consumer protection and human rights will be at the forefront. And this is a way to engage with the tech sector in this regard. Okay, well, I hope you're right on that data protection front in any case. Ambassador Klynge, thanks so much for your time. Ambassador Casper Klynge there, the world's first tech ambassador.